Dr. Allan Schore is on the clinical faculty of the Department of Psychiatry and Biobehavioral Sciences, UCLA David Geffen School of Medicine. He is the author of 6 seminal volumes, including The Science of the Art of Psychotherapy, and actually, not 6 now, 8, 2 just published books, Brain Psychotherapy and The Development of the Unconscious Mind, as well as numerous peer-reviewed articles and chapters. Dr. Schore's contributions appear in multiple disciplines, including neuroscience, psychotherapy, psychoanalysis, psychiatry, developmental psychology, attachment theory, trauma studies, and that's an abbreviated list. He is past editor of the Norton series on interpersonal neurobiology and a reviewer or on the editorial staff of 45 journals across a number of scientific and clinical disciplines. Dr. Schore has received quite a number of honors for his work, including an award for outstanding contributions to practice in trauma psychology, the Scientific Award from the Division of Psychoanalysis of the American Psychological Association, honorary membership by the American Psychoanalytic Association, and the Rice Davis Child Study Center Award for outstanding contributions to child and adolescent mental health. In addition to all his scholarly activities, he has had a private psychotherapy practice for over 4 decades, somehow in his spare time. In preparing for this introduction, I did some reading about Dr. Schore's development into the kind of integrative thinker he has become. I was fascinated to learn how he immersed himself for years in reading across many disciplines as a kind of intellectual play for himself, always with a sense that he would tie it together in a way that could change the way we think about human development. After the publication of his first book, Affect Regulation and the Origin of the Self, The Neurobiology of Emotional Development, he was proud to have been reviewed in the British Journal of Psychiatry and called a polymath, which I had to look up. And that is a person whose expertise spans a significant number of subject areas, known to draw on complex bodies of knowledge to solve specific problems. A perfect description. We are so fortunate to have Dr. Schore address those considerable talents to speaking to us on forging connections in group psychotherapy through right brain to right emotional communications. Thank you.
Now, what time are we talking about?
I'll let you know.
Okay. All right. Well, good morning. It's a pleasure and an honor to be invited here. I'm struck by how many familiar faces I have bumped into this morning. I also want to say before I begin here that early in my career, my original training was in not only in neuropsychology and individual psychotherapy, but also in group therapy. And for 10 years here at the Southern California Permanente group, I ran groups. And then after 10 years, when I started to be more seriously involved with the neuroscience, I kind of left it. But the group has always left a deep impression on me, and which was why I was really interested in the invitation to offer some thoughts about my theories and about essentially the change mechanisms in group psychotherapy, et cetera. So what I'm going to offer this morning is this forging connections in group psychotherapy through right brain to right brain emotional communications. And in the immortal words of Olivia Newton-John, let's get clinical. So over the last 3 decades, I've published numerous books, articles, chapters on regulation theory and the central role of the right brain unconscious mechanisms in emotional communication and in affect regulation, especially in early development, in psychopathogenesis, and also in psychotherapy. And in addition to offering developmental, interpersonal, neurobiological models of attachment and early relational trauma, a term that I brought forth in 2003, my work in interpersonal neurobiology characterizes the implicit right lateralized brain, mind, body, and more we're now seeing not just brain, but brain, mind, body mechanisms that operate unconsciously in these therapeutic change processes. Ian McGilchrist, a neuropsychiatrist from Britain, in his classic book, The Master and His Emissary, points out that the differences between the two cerebral hemispheres is profound. Each, the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere, have a distinct mode of functioning and create coherent, utterly different, and often incompatible versions of the world with competing priorities and values. So at this point in time, we're not thinking about two halves of one brain, but dual cortical, subcortical systems with unique structures and functions. And this lays out very nicely into a left hemispheric rational brain and a right hemispheric emotional brain. A linguistic brain on the left versus a social brain on the right. Implicit versus explicit self systems, and conscious minds versus unconscious minds. And the theme here for many years is that the right brain is the psychobiological substrate of the unconscious mind. So drawing on previous books and these two new volumes, which incidentally are in the bookstore, little quick ad, Right Brain Psychotherapy and the Development of the Unconscious Mind. What I want to do here this morning, I want to expand my neurobiological models of change processes in individual psychotherapy to some thoughts about what I see the change processes are in group psychotherapy. And I want to discuss the spontaneous right brain communications of conscious and unconscious affects beneath the words. As we're listening to the patient, we're listening to the narrative, but we're also listening beneath the words of group members' narratives and how these implicit nonverbal communication is embedded in group processes. And I want to suggest that right brain mechanisms are the primary mechanisms of change in both symptom-reducing psychotherapy, including symptom-reducing group psychotherapy, and on the other hand, in growth-promoting group psychotherapy. This distinction has been held now between two forms of the psychotherapy. Over the last 3 decades, I've suggested that the right brain acts as the psychobiological substrate of the human unconscious, and that it operates in everyday life, as Freud said. It also operates in the psychotherapeutic processes. And again, returning to McGilchrist, he concludes that the right hemisphere both grounds our experience of the world at the bottom end, so to speak, and makes sense of it at the top end. Notice, it's the right that makes sense and the meaning, not the conscious left. And therefore, this hemisphere is more in touch with both affect and the body, and that neurological evidence supports what is called the primacy of affect and the primacy of unconscious over conscious will. So again, over the decades, I've suggested that the right brain is the locus of the subjective self that communicates with other right brains, a subjective self that begins to build and form in the first year of life, way before there is a verbal self. So I want to give some updates on this right brain to right brain communication model. In 1994, in my first book, I suggested that brains align and synchronize their neural activities with other brains. And this occurs via right brain to right brain communications in the dyadic mother-infant attachment communications, and also in the dyadic patient-therapist social-emotional interactions. In 2003, in my second book, I suggested that the clinical operations of a relational unconscious exists whereby one unconscious mind communicates with another unconscious mind in nonverbal right brain to right brain communications. So the old idea that the unconscious was something that's intrapsychic, that floats up in dreams, etc., we now realize this mechanism is operating at all times in human communication beneath the words. However, this research evidence for this two-person, two-brain model awaited an emergent technology that could simultaneously measure two interacting brains. Most neuroscience research is looking at a single brain. In 2012, in The Science of the Art of Psychotherapy, I cited the work of Dumas, who called for a move from a classical one-brain neuroscience toward a novel two-body approach. And this parallels the shift from a one-person intrapsychic to a two-person relational psychology. In this decade, hyperscanning methodologies utilizing simultaneous EEG, functional magnetic resonance, near-infrared spectroscopy, and magnetoencephalography measurements have been created. This technological advance now allows us to study two brains in real-time social interactions with each other during rapid emotional communication. Indeed, inspired by nonverbal communications and coordinations between a mother and her infant, i.e. early mother-infant attachment communications, Dumas offered a dual EEG study of interbrain synchronization during a spontaneous social interaction between two people, characterized by reciprocal communication and turn-taking. This is a mechanism that is found in all forms of therapy. So in this study, interbrain synchronization during social interaction, he reported that the simultaneous brain measures of each member of a dyad occurs during interpersonal communication, where, quote, both participants are continuously active, each modifying their own actions in response to the continuously changing actions of their partner. These authors observed specific changes in both brains, indeed identical changes in both brains, during this nonverbal imitation, which is a central foundation of socialization and communication. In this relational context, both share attention and compare cues of self and others' actions. And they document an interbrain, not intrabrain, but interbrain synchronization on a milliseconds time scale, rapid, spontaneously, of the right central parietal regions in both interacting partners. And they also observe the right temporal parietal cortex in one partner is synchronized with the right temporal parietal cortex of the other. And this right temporal parietal cortex, this junction, back of the brain, right side, is known to be activated in social interactions and is centrally involved always in states of face and voice processing. Think psychotherapy now. It's also centrally involved in attention at to what one is focusing attention on, in perceptual awareness and empathy, empathic understanding. This right TPO integrates the input from visual, facial, auditory, tone of voice, somesthetic, gestural, and also emotional limbic areas, and is thus a pivotal neural locus for functions of the self. Indeed, the right temporal parietal occipital areas synchronized in two partners allows for making sense of another's mind. This following figure I'm going to show is the right lateralized interbrain synchronization. These two brains are operating at the same rate simultaneously. back and forth together, adjusting as they're moving, as the information is coming in. And they also represent, I'm going to suggest here, a spontaneous right brain to right brain communication between one subjective self and another. Note the mutual gaze. So this is what it looks like. We're looking top down on these brains. On the brain on the left, you see the activation in the right hemisphere and the brain on the right, and they are face to face with each other, eye to eye with each other, etc. You see the synchronization in the right hemispheres of both of these individuals. Right brain to right brain. In 2001, I applied this synchronization model to the psychotherapy context. And I said the attuned, intuitive clinician, from the first point of contact, is learning the nonverbal moment-to-moment rhythmic structures of the patient's internal states, the crescendos and the decrescendos of arousal, and is flexibly and fluidly modifying her own behavior to synchronize with that structure, thereby creating a context for the organization of the Therapeutic Alliance. My colleague Russell Mears in Australia describes a form of therapeutic conversation that can be conceived as a dynamic interplay between right hemispheres. This theme of synchronized right brain to right brain communications appears at the core of each chapter of this new volume, Right Brain Psychotherapy. In this book, I describe the neurobiological mechanisms, the interpersonal neurobiological mechanisms of affective communications, of attachment dynamics between the patient and the therapist. I also describe relational trauma, which is also a right brain phenomenon, transference, countertransference, and interactive affect regulation, all in a right brain model, all including right brain to right brain communications between the therapist and the patient. This psychotherapeutic synchronized and interactively regulated right lateralized communications facilitate neuroplastic structural changes in the patient's right brain regulatory systems, which in turn allow for optimal treatment outcomes in both symptom reducing and especially in growth promoting psychotherapy. In the central chapters of the book, The Growth Promoting Role of Mutual Regressions in Deep Psychotherapy, I'm now describing the importance of these synchronized shifts in hemispheric dominance, synchronized between the patient and the therapist, both at the same time, shifting dominance from the later maturing verbal left hemisphere into the early developing nonverbal right hemisphere, from the left brain conscious analytical mind to the right brain intuitive unconscious mind and bodily based emotions. That every time the patient is going into an emotional state, they're shifting from left to right, and we as therapists are synchronizing, shifting with them to be able to pick up those right brain emotional communications beneath the words. We're tracking the affect. I also discussed the critical role of synchronized transient clinical regressions, defined as the process of returning to an earlier stage of development in deep psychotherapy. And as there's allowed now a great deal of information to show that the right brain develops before the left. The right is there in the first year, year and a half. The left, Broca's, Wernicke, not really until the second year, et cetera. So this ability to shift from the verbal to the nonverbal is a key here. What you're looking at here is you see the left, right, et cetera. The callosal shift is left into the right hemisphere. Notice that the right hemisphere is connected at the bottom into the body, into autonomic functions, into arousal and pain systems, up into the limbic system, the amygdala, cingulate, the orbital frontal, and then the right hemisphere. And notice the output at the right hemisphere is imagery, not language, etc., into a conscious emotional experience. In these heightened affective moments of the session, when the patient is experiencing a right brain emotional state, the psychobiologically attuned therapist implicitly instantiates a regression, a reversible dominance over the left over the right hemisphere. And indeed, over time, the empathic clinician, sensitive to even low levels of the patient's subjective shifts into and out of affective states, learns how to fluidly synchronize this shift in hemispheric dominance with the patient's shifts. This is essentially what psychobiological attunement is. This right lateralized synchronization of a mutual regression allows for the communication and regulation of not just conscious, but also unconscious affects. Unconscious, certainly to the left hemisphere. And in the same book, Right Brain Therapy, I'm also presenting neuropsychoanalytic models that differentiate the affect-reducing roles of the character defenses of dissociation, found in trauma, and repression in working with these regressions in growth-promoting psychotherapy. And again, what I want to suggest, what we're looking at are mutual regressions, both shifting down into affect, into the right. Although the paradoxical process of regression may reflect a clinical deterioration, it may also represent a creative return to fundamentals and origins that can facilitate a potential reorganization leading to better integration, healthy individuation, and increases in the adaptive capacities of play and intimacy, both of which involve right and not left hemispheric analytic states. So what I want to do for most of this talk now is give some applications of interpersonal neurobiology and regulation theory to the change mechanisms in group psychotherapy. In 2014, in the journal Psychotherapy, which is the division journal of Division 29, the Division of Psychotherapy in the APA, I offered an article, "The Right Brain is Dominant in Psychotherapy." And I suggested that a paradigm shift is now occurring from cognitive content to emotional process. The left being involved with more with conscious cognition, the right more with unconscious affect. And as an individual therapy, affective, relational, and regulation change mechanisms central to group psychotherapy are activated in that setting. Group members' conscious and unconscious communications and their conscious and unconscious regulation of emotional states of the members. This right brain to right brain communication in both dyadic contexts, where we're talking about the Therapeutic Alliance, because in individual psychotherapy, clearly the Therapeutic Alliance between the patient and the therapist, co-constructed is the key variable, also applies to group social emotional interactions. That is the concept of cohesion, a construct obviously very familiar to the audience. These spontaneous, nonverbal emotional communications, especially during heightened affective moments, strong fear, strong anger, strong loss, etc., intense shame, etc. These are, especially during these heightened affective moments of dysregulating affects, are shared and witnessed by the group members. Interactive affect regulation, which I've suggested is the key to the attachment dynamic, from the group and from the leader, are central to the patient's therapeutic symptom-reducing and growth-promoting changes. The group provides a relational context in which a member lies within the focus of its collective explicit and especially implicit attention. I want to suggest that also the group members are listening to the narrative and they're intuitively also listening beneath the words for the affect. The group is synchronously resonating with the moment-to-moment nonverbal communication beneath the words of a focal member. The conscious and unconscious attention of the collective group observer-participant function can be not only on an individual psyche, a right brain subjective self, but it also can be on an emotional communicating member dyad, two people who are interacting with each other that the group is processing, working on their relationship within a group multi-brain context. With respect to the emergent social emotional connections of the group context, cohesion, as again I repeat, is the central construct of group psychotherapy. Cohesion, I want to suggest, in the heightened affective moments of the group, co-creates a right brain to right brain system of affect communication and regulation. And this synchronization of the right brains of the group members are occurring there also with the empathic leader. In a special issue of the journal Psychotherapy that came out 2 months ago, Burlingame presented an article, Evidence-Based Group Psychotherapy Relationships, Cohesion in Group Therapy, a meta-analysis. And they went on to say that cohesion, and again, on a number of these, I want to use the actual words and the voice of these people, also to show how these constructs are coming together. Cohesion is the most popular of several relationship constructs, e.g., alliance, group climate, group atmosphere, in clinical and empirical literature on groups. Over time, it has become synonymous with the therapeutic relationship in group psychotherapy. From perspective of a group member, relationships comprise three structural components: member-member, member group, and member leader. From the perspective of the therapist, relationships include the same three components, as well as two additional ones: the leader's relationship to the group as a whole, and in the case of a co-therapist, from one leader to another leader. So Burlingham and colleagues report that cohesion occurs in all forms of group psychotherapy. Quote, interpersonal, psychodynamic, cognitive behavioral, posted statistically significant cohesion outcome in the same way that the Therapeutic Alliance crosses all forms of psychotherapy, a basic mechanism. And they go on to say, in this discussion of cohesion, that emotional well-being, self-disclosure, interpersonal liking, and tolerance for personal space have been used as measures of cohesion. And they cite two dimensions of cohesion. The first dimension is structural. Vertical cohesion represents a member-leader relationship. A group member's perception of the group leaders, specifically competence, genuineness, and warmth. The horizontal cohesion describes a group member's relationship with other group members and with the group as a whole. The second dimension of group cohesion is the quality of the relationship or the affective or emotional nature of cohesion, interpersonal and emotional support. Emotional support is affect regulation, implicit affect regulation. Notice the emotional center at the center of the cohesion mechanism. This group cohesion describes forces that cause members to remain in the group, or, quote, sticking togetherness. The Oxford Dictionary defines cohesion as the act of sticking together or cohering, a tendency to remain united. In 2003, I offered evidence to show that the right hemisphere is central in maintaining a coherent, continuous, and unified sense of self. This right frontal lobe that connects the individual to emotionally salient experiences and memories underlying self-schemas is, quote, the glue holding together a sense of self. Again, it's emotion. These emotional connections being the title of this conference, and the shared regulatory functions are the glue holding together the group members across different emotional states, whether it be fear or joy or positive or negative. This cohesion mechanism, it's the emotional connection here that's the key as they move through different emotional states. The interpersonal neurobiology of cohesion is the cumulative expression of the group's capacity to communicate and interactively regulate a diverse variety of negative and positive emotional states, right brain to right brain. The expansion of the dyadic right lateralized interbrain synchronization to multiple right lateralized interbrain synchronization. So here we're not dealing with a dyad, but literally multiple brains now synchronizing on these affective states. Incidentally, I also want to suggest that we now know in individual psychotherapy that the key mechanism of the change is not necessarily inside, but it has more to do with changes in the emotional states, et cetera, the regulation. So this synchronization of multiple right brains during a shared spontaneous social interaction. This is a study in 2012, a neuroimaging study demonstrating emotions promote social interactions by synchronizing brain activity across individuals. So we're getting a synchronization now of the group members. This is a study in PLOS1 on evidence for unintentional emotional contagion beyond dyads. This unconscious and spontaneous emotional contagion is the tendency to automatically mimic and synchronize facial expressions, vocalizations, postures, and movements with those of another person, and consequently to converge emotionally is commonly studied in dyadic interactions. But referring to groups, this idea about emotional contagion beyond dyads, they demonstrate one is tuned to react to others' emotional signals and to unintentionally produce subtle but sufficient emotional cues to induce emotional states in others, reading faces, voices, gestures. It's an article by Ray in Frontiers of Psychology, Neural Substrate of Group Mental Health, Insights from Multi-Brain Reference Frame. They describe between brain connectivity within multiple brains, as in groups, and demonstrate facial, bodily, vocal expressions of emotions are unconsciously and spontaneously transmitted beyond dyads. And they use the Dumas image that I showed earlier of these coupled synchronized right brains. I suggest that group cohesion is mediated by multiple brains aligning and synchronizing their neural activities via right brain to right brain communications. So again, Burlingame suggested the most promising evidence for patient communication to cohesion lies in attachment styles. So work in psychotherapy research by Dinger, cohesion includes the relational attachment of a group members to one another, to the group leader, and to the group as a whole. And again, I've suggested that these attachment is expressed in right brain to right brain nonverbal emotional communication, face, voice, gesture. These emotional transactions can be interactively regulated, and personality differences occur in strategies of affect regulation and different attachment styles. So here's a study by Flores in the International Journal of Group Psychotherapy, Attachment Theory and Group Psychotherapy, where he applies, I assume I may be wrong, applies modern attachment theory, myself and Judith, and affective neuroscience to group psychotherapy. And Flores concludes, one overarching aim of attachment theory is to understand the neural basis of emotional disorders and the facilitation of affect regulation. Missing from more traditional models of group therapy has been a cogent articulation of the implicit non-conscious neural mechanisms in explaining how and why interpersonal emotional engagement accounts for the majority of the change process in psychotherapy. When compared to explicit declarative therapy models, again now applying this to the group context, the multiple reparative relational experiences offered by group therapy carry considerably more potential for promoting the expansion and internalization of non-conscious, automatic, implicit affect regulation. This is especially crucial since it is now evident that the bulk of the burden of affect regulation is implicit and non-conscious. Incidentally, this implicit unconscious affect regulation is in the right frontal cortex. Explicit conscious affect regulation and mentalization is in the left frontal cortex. So we're talking now about working directly in the right. Flores goes on to say, from an attachment theory perspective, the methods and techniques of all schools of therapy remain secondary to the therapist offered relational qualities referred to as the Therapeutic Alliance in individual therapy or Cohesion in group psychotherapy. Another by Grossmark, authenticity in leader working with the feelings we experience as group therapists is essential. The importance of authenticity has been demonstrated in individual psychotherapy, same thing in group psychotherapy. They go on to say, how do we most effectively use that information? Our affective responses is often the clue to the central but unspoken group themes. The creative leader, I want to suggest, is intuitively attuned to the hidden feelings, what he calls the hidden feelings of the group, including unconscious affects beneath the words. The leader's contribution to group cohesion is expressed in moment-to-moment implicit monitoring and regulating right hemispheric affect, but also the leader is also regulating a sense of safety and trust. Empathic leaders' receptive state of openness to experience and emotional presence allows synchronization with members' diverse affects and regulation strategies. And here's an article by Badenoch and Cox. They refer to Schore's right brain neurobiological processes. Because therapy group members often share common implicit experiences, abandonment, shame, terror, grief, they can easily collaborate with one another in making meaning of the experiences that lead to these painful states. So I have suggested that early painful and shameful states of attachment trauma stored in the right hemisphere can be unconscious, dissociated or repressed, refractory to left hemispheric interpretation. These negative affective states focus on psychodynamic group therapy. Attention is not only to conscious but unconscious affect and on internal object relations. As opposed to CBT, individual psychodynamic psychotherapy attempts not control but acceptance or facilitation of particular emotions, including defensively avoided, dissociated, or repressed emotions, in order to allow the patient to transform them into adaptive conscious emotions. The psychodynamic group promotes exploration of these affective states, including uncomfortable feelings or even unbearable, painful affects associated with trauma that therefore have been consciously and unconsciously avoided. I've also suggested that psychodynamic change models by neuropsychoanalysis, the neuroscience of unconscious processes, the right brain, the psychobiological substrate of Freud's unconscious in transference, countertransference. And here you see Grossmark and Wright relational approaches to group psychotherapy, Groups did not inhibit transference. They generated transferences not only to the leader, but to each other. These countertransference transactions are expressions of bidirectional, non-conscious, nonverbal, right brain, mind, body, dysregulating stressful communications between the patient and the therapist. The group patient's transferential limbic autonomic communications, again, are expressed in nonverbal, visual, auditory, gestural communications of face, voice, and body. And the countertransference of the therapist similarly is defined in nonverbal terms, autonomic responses that are reactions of an unconscious level to nonverbal messages. And the therapist's countertransference is also communicated through the face and the voice. Within psychodynamic group, heightened affective moments of spontaneous, rapid, implicit, right brain to right brain, nonverbal, bodily-based affective communication convey stressful, unconscious, transference, countertransference transactions within the alliance, which revive early attachment memories, especially intensely dysregulated affective states. In other words, reenactments of attachment trauma. There's a lot of interest now in these reenactments of early attachment trauma. These attachment dynamics of communication, interactive repair and regulation of the patient's dysregulating strong affects are a core mechanism of group therapeutic actions. These right brain emotional communications can be synchronized and resonated by all members of the group as well as the leader. Whiteheads Principle applies to group psychotherapy. Emotions are deepened in intensity and sustained in time when they are intersubjectively shared. So I'm suggesting that the group acts as a collective pre-verbal right brain emotional resonance system. This group right brain synchronization amplifies affect, allowing affects beneath levels of awareness to come into individual and group consciousness, and thus to be intersubjectively shared and interactively regulated. It's an article by Price in the International Journal of Group Psychotherapy, Into the Wild, working with pre-verbal experiences. In such work, the therapist acts as a guide into the group's exploration of deeper unconscious attachment experiences. Citing my work, he concludes, the entrenched patterns of group members are rooted in a developmental phase before words and symbolization are available to manage the stress. These group members enact in the here and now a relational dysfunction fixed in early attachment patterns. The defenses they induce resist interpretation by traditional analysis. He says that when leading a group, the induced sensations and feelings affect my emotional state and my physical body. And I've talked about somatic countertransference here. And Price offers rich vignettes stating early interventions need not involve words. In such instances, the leader senses the inner experience of a group member. Here we are primarily helping develop the pre-verbal self's affect regulatory system as a parent with an infant through attuned mirroring back of the experience she is having internally. When group members lose sensory control, it simulates the loss of both ego and reason, which hold us together on a daily basis. One slips to a time before words and thoughts. Therefore, the pre-verbal regression in the patient must be detected by the leader through affective resonance in the countertransference. Once detected, the leader can aptly join and mirror via nonverbal emotional communication. This joining in the regression allows for a mutual regression where they both let go of left hemispheric control. Recall, enactments are synchronized mutual regressions, transient reversals of hemispheric dominance, from left hemispheric reason to right hemispheric emotions, the return to an early attachment pre-verbal stage of development, and a right hemispheric autobiographical nonverbal memory of dysregulating relational trauma. And here's Grossmark and Wright. Group patients need not talk about their issues explicitly because they will demonstrate them. They will enact them. There is something inevitable and even positive about the regressive and progressive states. Grossmark focuses on the fluctuating relationship that members establish with the leader and each other. In these varying relationships, one can see the fundamental defensive patterns that each member has developed over time. Again, these are defenses against conscious experiencing strong, dysregulating affect. In right brain psychotherapy, I'm offering case material to offer an evidence-based model for working with defensive coping strategies in clinical reenactments of unconscious dissociated affect in spontaneous mutual regressions and unconscious repressed affect in voluntary mutual regressions. In fact, one of the major themes is that we must now pay attention to these defenses and the differences between dissociation and repression. So I'm going to end it up here with a few further applications of neuroscience to group therapy. In 2003, I suggested that the right amygdala, the right subcortical amygdala, is equivalent to the deep unconscious. In 2012, I stated the right amygdala may subserve a high-speed detection role for unconscious stimuli and for processing unconscious emotional learning. These implicit functions operate within an emotionally cohesive group via a right brain to right brain relational unconscious. Here you see Dinger and Schoenberg. The regulation of proximity and distance may either facilitate or hinder the development of individual experience cohesion. Summarizing a large body of neuropsychological data, Feinberg and Keenan conclude the right hemisphere, particularly the right frontal region, under normal circumstances, plays a crucial role in establishing the appropriate relationship between the self and the world. Dysfunction results in a two-way disturbance of personal relatedness between the self and the environment that can lead to disorders of both under and over relatedness between the self and the world. Think about a dismissing attachment versus an anxious attachment. Group members show both under and over relatedness between the self and the world. Recall Burlingham, cohesion is tolerance for personal space. In the journal Nature, Todd and Anderson show that the adaptive functions of the subcortical amygdala, and they describe the amygdala's role in regulating interpersonal distance. People automatically regulate the distance between themselves and others on the basis of feelings and personal comfort, and they refer to invisible social force fields that regulate close physical proximity, suggesting that the amygdala is crucial for the sense of interpersonal space. The amygdala should be more active at close interpersonal distances. This group synchronization of each member's right amygdala acts as a multi-brain interpersonal neurobiological mechanism that unconsciously regulates emotional distance and proximity of members within a group intersubjective field. And the development of cohesion, the central construct of group psychotherapy, is co-created essentially at unconscious levels. The major work on emotional connections of group psychotherapy occurs, I suggest, in the right brain, the psychobiological substrate of the human unconscious, and that group cohesion facilitates members' right brain emotional well-being. Hecht offers an extensive brain lateralization research concluding, human beings have an intrinsic need for affiliation, being connected, notice the title of the conference, with and accepted by other people. This fundamental need motivates people to seek warm, stable, and intimate interpersonal relationships, form friendships, and affiliate with specific groups. The need for affiliation and the need for a connection is primarily met by neural structures within the right hemisphere. Again, the conference title, Building Bridges of Connections Through Groups. These connections are forged in group right brain to right brain emotional communications. As in individual psychotherapy, in group therapy also, it's the right brain that is dominant. And I thank you for your attention.